Welcome to the lab number 2 demo video. Once again, I'll be showing you a few basic skills in Mathematica so that you can complete lab number 2. At the top, there's a reminder, please format your lab properly. What I'm going to cover in this video is how to graph functions and how to change the style and format of graphs. And same as in the other video, the examples that I do here are not part of the lab. You do not need to submit a copy of what is contained in this video. All right, so first thing we're going to cover today is how to graph functions. So here I've got a problem that says create a graph of the function g of x equals x to the fifth minus 2x to the fourth plus 3x. And hopefully you have watched the lab 1 video and completed lab 1, and that's where we discussed how to enter functions into Mathematica. So you can see I have set that up, and I'm just going to go ahead and hit Shift Enter. The command for creating a graph using Mathematica is the plot command. So I'm going to type in plot, again, must be capitalized, square bracket afterwards, and then you're going to put the name of the function that you're looking to graph, g of x. Now notice in the name, I don't need the underscore now. And if I were to just do that, you're going to see a little red arrow pop up there. If I try to hit Shift Enter, it's going to say plot called with 1 argument, 2 arguments are expected. You have to give Mathematica more information than just what to graph. I can click there, put my cursor there, I'm going to put a comma, and then I'm going to use set brackets around the next part. In the set brackets, I'm going to say variable x, comma, and I'm going to define the domain that I want Mathematica to graph. So I'm going to just choose -10 to +10. I still have my square bracket at the end, and now I do Shift Enter. All I have told Mathematica to do with this command is to create the graph and have the graph go from -10 to +10 on the x-axis. You will notice it chose its own y-axis scale. These numbers are a little bit ridiculous and probably more than we need to see. There are ways to customize the graph. That's what I'll show you next in section 2, is how to change the style, the format of a graph. But just to introduce it back up here, if I want to control the scale on the y-axis, the command I use for that is the plot range. Remember, domain is the set of x values, range is the set of y values. And I'm going to actually choose the plot range command that comes up, because you'll notice it'll also give me this little arrow, which you need when you use the plot range command. If you were to just type plot range, and it does have to be capital P plot, capital R range, you can actually make the arrow yourself by hitting the subtraction sign, hitting the greater than sign, and you'll notice now when I open up my curly brackets, it'll just make that into an arrow. For plot range, I'm going to specify what y values I want to see. I'm going to set it to be -10 to 10. Now, because this is the plot range command, I don't need to put a y in the start of this set bracket expression. I'm going to go ahead and hit Shift Enter on that. Notice you get quite a different picture here. You can actually see a little bit of the function's behavior as opposed to the first graph that we looked at. It is important for you as the user to understand how to customize a graph so that you are seeing an accurate representation. Let's go down and talk about some of those customization options. All right. How to change the style and format of graphs. The first 2 basic commands are axes origin and axes label. I'm going to leave my plot range command sitting there, and I am going to put in axes origin. This is another command that's going to want that little arrow. So I'm going to do subtraction sign, greater than sign. I will use the curly set brackets again, and I'm going to set it to 0, 0. If I do Shift Enter on this command, you're not going to notice much of a change from the last graph. For instance, if I change this, let's say to 5, 5, you can see that the axes have been moved so that they now cross at the point 5, 5. It's a way to adjust the axes on a graph. That looks a little weird to me, so I'm going to put it back to 0, 0. And then the other basic command here is the axes label command. It will again want the arrow. With the axes label command, you are telling it what labels you want on the X and Y axis, with the X always going first and the Y always going second. You can see now the X is now labeled on the X axis, the Y is on the Y axis. You could change this to time and position. Okay, so that's how you would go about labeling your axes. We saw an example of how you use plot range up above here. I already have that command sitting in my plot command. This is the most basic usage of it, where you just define the lowest and the highest Y values that you want displayed on your graph. And I'm going to put that down here, and I'm going to change my plot range to full. What that will do is adjust the graph so that whatever you set your X minimum and your X maximum to, -10 to +10, it will adjust this Y-axis scale so that you see all of the graph between those two X values. You have one last option with plot range, which is if you want to customize in particular which part of the X axis you see, you can do that as well. So after the plot range command, I'm going to open up two set brackets. Automatically, the first set of set brackets contains X values. I want to graph X values from 0 to 5, always lowest to highest. Then I'm going to put a comma, and then I'm going to indicate what my Y values should be. This time I'm just going to say -100 to +100. I do Shift Enter on that. It's complaining. All right, this is a great example though. This is what's going to happen to you. And when I went over here to the side, I was able to click on this plus sign and it gave me an explanation for why I was getting an error. It says I don't have a closing set bracket. So I'm going to go back to my command and put in a set bracket. Now we're good to go. Please understand what you're controlling with these X values, the 0 and 5, and these X values, the -10 to 10. The first set of X values, you are actually controlling what part of the function gets graphed. For instance, I'll make this 1 to 2.5. Now it has cut off and only graphed the portion of the function that goes from 1 to 2.5. The plot range X values is controlling the labeling on the axis. I said I want my graph to go from 0 to 5 on the x-axis and from -100 to +100. That's the difference between those two commands. So those are your options with the plot range command. Now, the last one is the one that's the most fun, and that is the plot style command. Here was our basic graph. Now let's start to change it. And again, you can continue just adding commands inside the square brackets of the plot command. I'm going to go ahead and put a comma here. I'm going to now introduce the plot style command. Once again, it does require an arrow afterwards, and you'll notice it's suggesting some options here. The first thing you can do with plot style is you can specify a color. So if I would like my graph to be green, you can type a color name, and now it's green. Ooh, I can make it red. You've got all the basic color names after the plot style command. The other thing that you can do is you can specify whether it's a thick or a thin line. All right, notice it went back to blue because I took away the original command, and it made the graph a little bit more thick. I'll show you thin. Obviously, thin is really quite thin. The third thing you can do is you can opt to have a dotted line, or you can have a dashed line. If you're only going to put in one of those style options, you just put it right after the arrow. But if I really want to get super fancy and say, oh, I want it to be red and thick and dashed, in that case, you're going to open up set brackets and you're going to put all of those commands and hit Shift and Enter, and now it has applied all of those commands. The last thing I'm going to show you is you can graph multiple functions on a graph at one time. So I'm going to quickly define another function. I'm going to store that. Now if I go back up to my plot command, I can have it graph both my f of x and g of x on the same graph. But kind of like with the plot style command, when you're going to give more than one of something, the set brackets need to be introduced. I'm going to put f of x in and then leave g of x there. They don't have to be in any particular order. I close the set brackets around there. And now if I just do that, I've created a little bit of confusion. Let me take the plot style back out and show you what the default would be. Now, I can still use plot style to change the style of this graph. However, once you put in multiple functions, you're going to open up two sets of set brackets. The first one, you are automatically defining the style for whichever function comes first in the beginning of the plot command. I'm going to do red and dashed will apply to f of x. Now I open up a second set of set brackets for my second function, g of x. Mathematica automatically assumes that the first set of set brackets applies to the first function, f of x. Second set applies to the second function. So I've put in an example that's similar to what you're going to be asked to do in lab number 2. We're asked to define our function g of x equals sine of x. I'm asked to plot g of x with the following specifications. First of all, use the g of x symbol. First, of course, I need to do the function definition. Shift enter. Now my plot command, I'm going to put g of x. The next thing I'm told is I want the graph to start from x equals pi and end at 2 pi. Remember, the plot command, you always have to have a second argument. So I am going to put in from pi to 2 pi. I want the origin of the graph to be 0, 0. That's the axes origin command, and set that to 0, 0. Next are indications of how we want the axes set up. And so that's going to require the plot range command. And you'll notice I'm specifying both the horizontal and the vertical axis. So I'm going to do 2 curly set brackets to open. The first set will contain the horizontal axis from 0 to 4 pi, and the second set will be the vertical axis. I'm going to close all that up, and there's my graph. It does, in fact, only graph the part from about pi, 3.14-ish, to 2 pi, 6.2-ish. The axes are meeting at the point 0, 0. The horizontal axis does go from 0 to 4 pi. The vertical axis goes from -2 to +2. So with that example, you should be ready to begin lab number 2.